Some children are born into loving families. Others spend their entire childhood trying to earn a place in one. That was the first lesson I learned, though I was only 10 years old when I finally understood it. My name is Noah Bennett, and if you had walked into our small house on the edge of Cedar Creek, Ohio, back then, you probably would have thought we were an ordinary family. We had a white fence that needed repainting every spring. We had a narrow front porch with 2 old rocking chairs. We had family photographs hanging in the hallway. From the outside, everything looked normal, but families can hide a lot behind closed doors. The day everything changed started like any other Saturday. My mother, Linda, spent the morning cleaning the kitchen while my older brother Jason watched television in the living room. Mark, my stepfather, was outside repairing the lawn mower. I remember sitting at the dining room table working on a school project. My teacher had asked us to write about our future. Most kids wrote about becoming firefighters, doctors, or professional athletes. I wrote that I wanted to build something important one day. I did not know what that something was. I only knew I wanted my life to matter. Around 6 o'clock, we all gathered for dinner. The smell of meatloaf filled the house. The television hummed softly in the next room. For a few minutes, everyone ate quietly. Then my mother mentioned that the school was organizing a science camp for gifted students. She smiled when she told them I had been recommended. His teacher says he has real talent, she said. I still remember the feeling that rushed through me. Hope. A small, fragile kind of hope. Maybe this would be the first time my family would be proud of me. Mark put down his fork and looked across the table. And how much is that going to cost? He asked. My mother hesitated. About $400. $400. Looking back, it was not a fortune. But in that moment, the number seemed to change everything. Mark laughed once. Not because he thought something was funny. Because he thought the idea itself was ridiculous. Then he said words I would never forget. We can barely keep up with our bills, and now we are supposed to spend money on another one of Noah's dreams. Nobody spoke. Jason kept eating. My mother stared down at her plate. I felt my face grow warm. Mark shook his head and pointed his fork in my direction. That kid is already enough of a burden. The room became silent. I waited for someone to disagree. I waited for my mother to say he was wrong. I waited for Jason to look up. Nobody did. The clock above the stove ticked loudly. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Life continued as if nothing important had happened. But something had happened. A line had been crossed. For the first time, I realized what they thought of me. Not as a son. Not as family. As a problem. As an expense. As someone who made life harder. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling in my small bedroom. The house creaked softly around me. Moonlight spilled through the window and stretched across the floorboards. I kept replaying Mark's words over and over again. A burden. The strange thing was that I did not cry. I simply listened to the silence. And somewhere inside that silence, a decision quietly formed. If the people around me believed I was a burden, then one day I would prove them wrong. I did not know how. I did not know when. I only knew I would never forget that dinner table. Years later, my family would remember that night for a very different reason. But at 10 years old, sitting alone in the dark, all I knew was that nobody had saved me a seed in their hearts. And I was about to begin a journey that none of them would ever see coming. After that night, I stopped expecting people to notice me. It sounds sad when I say it now, but at 10 years old it felt more like survival. Expectations can hurt when they are never met. So I lowered mine. Every morning I woke up before everyone else, made my bed, packed my school bag, and walked to the bus stop alone. Jason usually got rides from friends or family members. Nobody offered me one. At school, things were different. Teachers knew my name. They smiled when I answered questions. They displayed my projects on classroom walls. For a few hours, each day, I felt visible. Then the final bell would ring, and I would return to being the kid nobody talked about at home unless something went wrong. The science camp came and went without me. I watched other students leave for the program that summer. They returned with stories about experiments, competitions, and new friendships. I listened quietly and pretended it did not bother me. Instead, I spent those weeks at the public library downtown. The building was old, with tall windows and shelves that seemed to stretch forever. The librarians knew me by name because I was there almost every day. Sometimes I would stay until closing time. Books became my escape. They also became my teachers. I learned about engineering, business, history, and people who had overcome impossible odds. The more I read, the more I realized that many successful people started with very little. Some had less than I did. That thought stayed with me. At home, the difference between Jason and me became harder to ignore. When Jason brought home average grades, everyone celebrated his effort. When I brought home straight A's, the report card often sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Birthdays followed a similar pattern. Jason received bicycles, sports equipment, and expensive electronics over the years. My gifts were usually practical items that someone said I needed anyway. I told myself not to compare. But children noticed these things. One afternoon, when I was 11, I came home from school carrying a certificate for winning a regional academic competition. I had worked for months preparing for it. The principal shook my hand in front of hundreds of people. For the first time in my life, I felt proud of myself. I walked through the front door smiling. Mark was watching television. My mother was folding laundry. I held up the certificate and told them I had won. My mother smiled briefly and said congratulations. Mark barely looked away from the screen. That is nice, he said. Then he asked whether I had remembered to take out the trash. That was the entire conversation. Later that evening, I hung the certificate on my bedroom wall myself. There were no photographs. No celebration. No special dinner. Just me standing on a chair with a thumbtack and a piece of paper that represented months of hard work. As strange as it sounds, that moment changed me. Not because I was angry, because I understood something important. If I wanted approval, I might spend my entire life chasing it. If I wanted a future, I would have to build it myself. Around that time, a new teacher arrived at our school. Her name was Grace Miller. She taught 6th grade science and mathematics. Most students liked her because she made difficult subjects interesting. I noticed something else. She paid attention. Not the kind of attention adults usually give children. Real attention. She noticed who stayed after class. She noticed who asked questions. She noticed who sat alone during lunch. One rainy afternoon, she stopped me as I was leaving school. She held one of my assignments in her hand and asked a simple question. Noah, has anyone ever told you how talented you are? I stood there silently because I honestly did not know how to answer. And without realizing it, I was about to meet the first person who would change the direction of my entire life. I stood in the hallway holding my backpack while rain tapped softly against the school windows. For several seconds, I could not answer Mrs. Grace Miller's question. Nobody had ever asked me something like that before. Teachers had complimented my grades. Librarians had recommended books. But nobody had ever looked directly at me and asked whether I knew I was talented. Finally, I shrugged. I guess not, I said. She studied me for a moment. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable. In a way that made me feel seen. Then she smiled. Well, I am telling you now. Those simple words stayed with me during the entire walk home. The sidewalks were wet from the rain. Cars splashed through puddles along Main Street. Normally, I spent that walk thinking about homework or chores waiting for me at home. That day, I thought about possibility. The next week, Mrs. Miller invited me to join an after-school academic club. It met every Tuesday and Thursday in a small classroom near the library. There were only 8 students. Most of them came from families that encouraged their interests. Their parents picked them up after meetings. Their parents attended competitions. Their parents asked questions about their projects. At first, I felt out of place. But Mrs. Miller never allowed me to disappear into the background. Whenever I solved a difficult problem, she acknowledged it. Whenever I doubted myself, she challenged me to think bigger. Slowly, something inside me began to change. For years, I had viewed myself through the eyes of people who believed I was a burden. Now someone was offering me a different mirror. One afternoon, she handed me an application for a statewide academic enrichment program. Students from across Ohio competed for a limited number of spots. The acceptance rate was extremely low. I looked at the paperwork and immediately shook my head. There is no way I could get in, I said. Mrs. Miller leaned back in her chair. Do you know what separates successful people from everyone else? I waited for her answer. They apply before deciding they will fail. I spent the next month working on essays, recommendations, and projects. Every evening after finishing my chores, I sat at the small desk in my bedroom and worked until late at night. Nobody in my family asked what I was doing. Nobody seemed curious. In some ways, that helped. There were no expectations to meet except my own. When the application was finally complete, Mrs. Miller mailed it herself. Then we waited. Weeks passed. Life continued as usual. Jason remained the center of attention at home. Mark continued treating my accomplishments as minor inconveniences. My mother moved quietly through each day, avoiding conflict whenever possible. Sometimes I wondered whether she saw what was happening. Sometimes I wondered whether it hurt her too. Then one Friday afternoon, a large envelope arrived at school. Mrs. Miller called me into her classroom after the final bell. The envelope sat on her desk. My hands were shaking before I even opened it. She folded her arms and smiled. "Go ahead." I carefully unfolded the letter inside. The first sentence blurred because my eyes filled with tears. I blinked and read it again. "Congratulations. You have been accepted." For a moment, I could not breathe. Out of thousands of applicants, I had been chosen. Mrs. Miller looked happier than I did. She laughed and handed me a tissue. "I told you." That evening, I carried the acceptance letter home. Part of me still hoped this time might be different. Maybe this achievement would finally matter. Maybe someone would look at me and see more than a problem to be managed. But as I walked through the front door and heard voices drifting from the living room, I had no idea that another conversation was waiting for me. A conversation that would reveal just how far my family was willing to go to keep me from believing in my own future. The voices coming from the living room belonged to Mark and Jason. They were sitting on the couch watching a football game when I stepped inside. I stood in the doorway holding the acceptance letter so tightly that the edges had started to bend. My heart was still racing from the excitement of a few minutes earlier. For once, I allowed myself to imagine a different outcome. Maybe they would be impressed. Maybe they would realize I was capable of something meaningful. Maybe this achievement would matter. "What is that?" Mark asked without taking his eyes off the television. I handed him the letter. He skimmed the first paragraph and then passed it to Jason. Neither of them looked particularly interested. Jason read it more carefully. "Looks like a big deal," he admitted. For a brief moment, hope returned. Then Mark shrugged. "Sounds expensive." Those two words landed harder than they should have. My mother walked into the room, drying her hands with a dish towel. Jason handed her the letter. As she read it, her face brightened. "Noah, this is wonderful." It was the first genuinely enthusiastic reaction I received all day. I smiled. Then Mark spoke again. "Wonderful until they start asking for money." The room became quiet. My mother looked at him. "It is a scholarship program." Mark folded his arms. "Scholarship does not cover everything." He leaned back into the couch and shook his head. "We already spend enough on that kid." I felt the familiar sting in my chest. The same feeling I had experienced at the dinner table months earlier. The feeling of being discussed instead of spoken to. My mother opened her mouth as if she wanted to argue, but the words never came. She looked down at the letter and then back at me. The silence said everything. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat at my desk staring at the acceptance packet. The moonlight filtered through the curtains. The house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. I carefully read every page again. The program would last 6 weeks during the summer. Students from all over the state would attend advanced classes and work with university professors. It was the kind of opportunity people remembered for the rest of their lives. Yet as I looked at the paperwork, I realized something important. Nobody in my family was going to help me get there. If I wanted this opportunity, I would have to find a way myself. The next morning, I visited Mrs. Miller before school started. She immediately noticed something was wrong. Teachers often see things that other people miss. I told her about the conversation at home. I told her about the concerns over money. I told her that I was worried I might have to decline the offer. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she smiled. Then she opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out another folder. "Before you make any decisions," she said, "there is something you need to know." Inside the folder were applications for additional grants, travel assistance programs, and academic sponsorships. My eyes widened. "These exist?" I asked. She laughed softly. "Noah, there are people who want students like you to succeed." That sentence changed something inside me. For so many years, I had believed opportunities belonged to other people. Children with supportive families. Children with advantages. Children who were wanted. Yet here was proof that the world was larger than the walls of my house. Over the next several weeks, Mrs. Miller helped me complete every application. We stayed after school reviewing essays and paperwork. Slowly, pieces began falling into place. Then one afternoon, another letter arrived. And this one would become the first step toward a future that nobody in Cedar Creek, especially Mark, could have imagined. The second letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon near the end of the school year. I was helping shelve books at the public library when Mrs. Miller rushed through the front doors looking more excited than I had ever seen her. She was holding a large envelope in one hand and waving it above her head. Even before she reached me, I knew something important had happened. "Open it," she said, slightly out of breath. My hands trembled as I carefully unfolded the letter. The words seemed impossible at first. Full scholarship. Housing included. Travel assistance approved. Educational materials covered. I read the page 3 times before I truly believed it. Every obstacle that had stood between me and the program had suddenly disappeared. Mrs. Miller laughed when she saw my expression. "I told you there were people willing to invest in talent." For the first time in my life, I felt as though a door had opened just for me. That summer changed everything. The program took place on a university campus nearly 200 miles from Cedar Creek. It was the farthest I had ever traveled alone. I still remember stepping off the bus with a single suitcase and looking up at the enormous brick buildings. Students from every corner of the state filled the campus. Some came from wealthy suburbs. Others came from rural towns. Yet for the first time, nobody cared where I came from. They cared about ideas, curiosity, effort. I spent 6 weeks attending advanced classes, working on projects, and meeting people who dreamed as big as I did. Every day felt like discovering a new world. Professors challenged us to solve problems. Guest speakers shared stories about careers I had never imagined. At night, I sat in my dorm room writing notes about everything I wanted to accomplish one day. Back home, life continued without me. My mother called whenever she could. The conversations were brief but meaningful. She always asked if I was eating enough. She always told me she was proud of me. Those words mattered more than she probably realized. Mark rarely came up in our conversations. Neither did Jason. For the first time, I was experiencing life beyond the limits of my family. When the program ended, I returned to Cedar Creek carrying more than a suitcase. I carried confidence, not arrogance. Confidence. There is a difference. Confidence grows when effort begins producing results. As the years passed, I continued chasing opportunities. I won additional academic competitions. I earned scholarships. I spent weekends studying while many of my classmates attended parties or football games. Sometimes it was lonely. Sometimes it was exhausting. But every achievement became another brick in the foundation I was building. At home, little changed. Jason remained the favorite. Mark remained distant. Yet something inside me had shifted permanently. Their opinions no longer determined my worth. By the time I graduated from high school, several universities had offered admission packages. The day the acceptance letters arrived, I spread them across my bed and stared at them in disbelief. Places I had only read about in books were inviting me to attend. When I showed the letters to my family, the reactions were mixed. My mother cried. Jason looked impressed. Mark simply nodded and asked how much debt I planned to accumulate. I smiled because his response no longer surprised me. A few weeks later, I packed my belongings into 2 old suitcases. Everything I owned fit into the trunk of a borrowed car. As I stood in the driveway preparing to leave, nobody asked me to stay. Nobody said the house would feel empty without me. The silence hurt more than I expected, but it also gave me freedom. As the town disappeared in my rearview mirror, I made myself a promise. I would never return looking for approval. I would return only after building a life so meaningful that nobody could deny what I had become. At the time, I thought success would be the hardest part of that journey. I had no idea that disappearing from my family's life would be much easier than eventually coming back into it. College was nothing like Cedar Creek. Nobody knew my history. Nobody knew the quiet boy who ate dinner after everyone else had finished. Nobody knew the kid who learned not to expect applause. On campus, I was simply Noah Bennett, a freshman with a scholarship and a schedule packed with classes. It felt strange at first. Freedom often does when you have never experienced it before. During my first semester, I worked harder than I ever had. While many students spent weekends exploring the city or attending football games, I spent mine in libraries, study groups, and computer labs. Not because I lacked a social life, because I had spent too many years waiting for opportunities to waste them once they arrived. The habits I developed as a child became advantages. I knew how to work alone. I knew how to stay focused. I knew how to keep going even when nobody was watching. By the end of my second year, professors began recommending me for internships. One opportunity led to another. A summer research position became a paid project. A paid project became a professional connection. Slowly, the future I once imagined at a small desk in my bedroom started becoming real. During those years, my contact with home grew less frequent. My mother still called every few weeks. Sometimes she mailed handwritten notes tucked inside greeting cards. I kept every one of them. Jason called occasionally as well. Our conversations were polite but brief. Mark almost never spoke to me directly. If he was mentioned at all, it was usually through my mother. Apparently, life in Cedar Creek continued exactly as it always had. Some part of me found comfort in that. Another part found sadness. For years passed quickly. Graduation arrived on a bright spring morning. Thousands of families filled the stadium seats. Parents carried flowers. Grandparents waved cameras. Children sat on shoulders. As graduates crossed the stage, cheers echoed throughout the crowd. I remember searching the audience before the ceremony began. My mother was there. She had driven several hours to attend. She sat alone near the middle section wearing a blue dress and holding a small bouquet. Seeing her made me smile. But there were 3 empty seats beside her. Jason was not there. Mark was not there. Nobody had come with her. For a moment, the old feeling returned. The feeling of being overlooked. Then I looked at my mother again. She was smiling through tears. That was enough. After graduation, a technology company offered me a position in Columbus. It was the kind of opportunity young professionals dream about. The salary seemed unbelievable to someone who grew up counting every dollar. The office occupied the top floors of a glass building overlooking the city skyline. On my first day, I stood near the windows staring out at the streets below and thought about Cedar Creek. I thought about the library. I thought about Mrs. Miller. I thought about the science camp I never attended. Life has a strange way of rewarding persistence years after the effort is made. The next decade passed faster than I expected. Promotions came. Responsibilities increased. I built a career that challenged me and fulfilled me. Eventually, I helped launch projects that gained national attention. Industry publications started mentioning my name. Invitations to speak at conferences followed. Somewhere along the way, people began referring to me as an expert. Every time I heard that word, I thought about the boy who once hung his own certificate on a bedroom wall because nobody else cared enough to do it. Through all of it, I rarely returned home. Not out of anger, out of distance. Cedar Creek belonged to another version of me. Then one autumn afternoon, nearly 20 years after I left, my phone rang while I was sitting in my office overlooking downtown Columbus. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Something in my chest tightened immediately. She never called during work hours unless something was important. When I answered, her voice sounded older than I remembered, and what she said next would bring me back to Cedar Creek for the first time in years. My mother's voice sounded calm, but I could hear the exhaustion beneath it. She told me she had been dealing with health issues and did not want to worry me until she understood more about what was happening. The doctors were optimistic, she said, but she needed additional tests and follow-up appointments. Then she hesitated. There is something else, she added quietly. Jason had recently lost his job. The factory where he worked had downsized, and many employees had been let go. Life in Cedar Creek had become difficult for a lot of families. I listened carefully while staring out the window of my office. Cars moved through downtown Columbus far below. People hurried along sidewalks. The city continued its busy rhythm, while my thoughts drifted back to the small town I had spent years trying to leave behind. By the end of the call, I had already made my decision. 2 weeks later, I drove back to Cedar Creek. The roads looked smaller than I remembered. The storefronts along Main Street had changed. Some businesses were gone. Others had taken their place. Yet certain things remained exactly the same. The library still stood near the town square. The old water tower still rose above the rooftops. Even the diner where high school students used to gather after football games remained open. When I pulled into my mother's driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The house looked older. So did the people standing on the porch. My mother hugged me first. She held on longer than usual. Jason greeted me next. His hair was beginning to gray around the temples. He seemed genuinely happy to see me. Then I noticed Mark standing near the front door. For a second, neither of us moved. Nearly 20 years had passed since I left. Yet some memories remained surprisingly close. Finally, he nodded. Good to see you, Noah. It was not warm. It was not cold. Just awkward. The first evening felt strange. We sat around the same dining table where so many important moments of my childhood had unfolded. The furniture had changed. The wallpaper was different. But the room still carried echoes of the past. During dinner, Jason asked questions about my work. My mother listened proudly. Mark remained mostly quiet. Occasionally, he would glance at me as though trying to reconcile the person sitting across from him with the boy he remembered. The next morning, I accompanied my mother to a medical appointment in a nearby city. Thankfully, the news was encouraging. Her doctors expected a full recovery with proper treatment and monitoring. Relief washed over both of us. On the drive home, she stared out the passenger window for several minutes before speaking. "You know," she said softly, "people around here talk about you all the time." I laughed. "I doubt that." She smiled. "You would be surprised." Over the next few days, I discovered she was right. Former teachers recognized me at restaurants. Neighbors asked about projects they had read about online. Business owners introduced me to their children and encouraged them to ask questions about college and careers. The attention felt uncomfortable. I was not seeking recognition. I had simply built a life. Yet the town seemed proud of what one of its own had accomplished. One evening, a local community leader stopped by the house with an invitation. The town was organizing an annual civic banquet and wanted me to attend as a guest of honor. Apparently, several people had nominated me. I tried to decline politely. The organizer refused to accept no for an answer. "This community wants to celebrate your success," he said. Word spread quickly. By the time the banquet arrived a week later, half the town seemed eager to attend. What I did not realize was that the event would become much more than a celebration. It would force my family to confront a version of the past they had spent years avoiding. And before the evening was over, truths that had remained unspoken for decades would finally be impossible to ignore. The civic banquet took place in the ballroom of the old community center on the edge of town. I remembered attending school events there as a child. Back then, I usually sat in the audience watching other people receive awards. Now, as I walked through the doors wearing a dark suit and greeting familiar faces, the experience felt surreal. Round tables filled the room. White tablecloths covered every surface. Photographs from Cedar Creek's history decorated the walls. Nearly 200 people attended. Former teachers, business owners, local officials, neighbors, and families filled the seats. My mother sat proudly beside me. Jason sat on her other side. Mark occupied the chair across from us. Throughout dinner, people approached our table to shake hands and share stories. Some remembered my academic competitions. Others remembered seeing me at the library nearly every day after school. A retired librarian even laughed while telling everyone that she used to worry they would have to lock me inside the building at closing time because I never wanted to leave. The room filled with warm memories I had forgotten existed. Then the evening program began. The mayor welcomed everyone and spoke about community values, perseverance, and opportunity. Several awards were presented. A local teacher was recognized. A volunteer firefighter received an honor. Then my name was announced. Applause echoed throughout the ballroom as I walked toward the stage. I thanked everyone politely and expected to return to my seat after a few brief remarks. Instead, the master of ceremonies surprised me. He smiled and said there was one more presentation planned. A large screen behind the stage illuminated. Photographs began appearing one after another. Images from my school years, academic competitions, newspaper clippings, university achievements, professional accomplishments, projects I had worked on, community initiatives I had supported, awards I never realized anyone in Cedar Creek had been following. Murmurs spread through the audience. Even I was surprised by how much information they had gathered. Then something unexpected happened. The presenter revealed that for nearly 10 years, an anonymous donor had funded scholarships for local students pursuing higher education. The total amount exceeded several $100,000. The room reacted with admiration. People whispered to one another. The presenter paused dramatically before revealing the donor's identity. My identity. Silence filled the ballroom for a second before applause erupted louder than before. I looked toward my mother. Tears streamed down her face. Jason stared at me in complete disbelief. Across the table, Mark looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The presenter continued speaking. Over the years, dozens of students from Cedar Creek had received assistance through those scholarships. Many were first-generation college students. Several were now successful professionals themselves. I never publicized any of it because recognition had never been the point. Someone helped me when I needed it. I simply wanted to do the same for others. When the presentation ended, I returned to my table feeling overwhelmed. People stood to applaud. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others shook their heads in amazement. Then an elderly woman approached. I recognized her immediately. Mrs. Grace Miller. Time had added gray hair and wrinkles, but her smile remained unchanged. The entire room watched as she hugged me. I always knew, she whispered. For a moment, I was 12 years old again, standing in her classroom. After she returned to her seat, the atmosphere felt different. Not because of my career, not because of the awards, because people were beginning to understand the full story. As conversations continued, several former teachers shared memories of helping me find opportunities when resources at home were limited. Others spoke about seeing me study alone after school. Piece by piece, the reality of my childhood emerged. Nobody directly accused anyone. Nobody needed to. By the time dessert was served, many eyes had quietly turned toward the same person sitting across from me. And for the first time in his life, Mark appeared unable to look away from the truth everyone else could suddenly see. The drive home from the banquet was quieter than the evening itself. My mother sat beside me looking out the window while the lights of Cedar Creek slipped past in the darkness. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. I wish I had done more, she said softly. The words hung in the air between us. I knew what she meant. She was not talking about scholarships or opportunities. She was talking about years. Years when she saw more than she said. Years when she wanted to protect me, but did not always know how. I glanced at her and smiled. You did more than you think. Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded. When we arrived home, the porch light was still on. Jason stood near the front door. Mark sat alone in one of the old rocking chairs. The moment felt strangely familiar, almost like life had brought us back to the same place where everything started, only this time the truth was sitting with us. Jason hugged me before heading inside. My mother followed. Mark remained on the porch. As I turned to leave, he spoke. Can we talk? For a moment, I considered saying no. Not because I was angry, because I was tired. But something in his voice made me stop. I sat down in the chair beside him. The night air was cool. Crickets chirped in the distance. The town was quiet. Mark stared out at the yard for several seconds before speaking again. I was wrong. The words came slowly, as though he had carried them for a very long time. I remained silent. He looked down at his hands. For years, I convinced myself that I was being practical, that I was treating everyone fairly. But tonight, his voice faltered. Tonight I realized how much I missed. I thought about the dinner table, the science camp, the certificates hanging alone on my bedroom wall, the countless moments when approval never came. Strangely, none of them hurt the way they once had. Time had changed them. They were no longer wounds. They were lessons. I cannot change the past, Mark continued. But I wish I could. The honesty surprised me. This was not the man I remembered from my childhood. Pride had finally given way to reflection. I looked toward the dark street beyond the yard. Neither of us can change it, I said. We can only decide what we do next. He nodded slowly. For the first time in my life, there was no argument between us. No disappointment. No judgment. Just two people acknowledging the truth. The next morning, I prepared to leave Cedar Creek. My mother packed sandwiches for the drive, even though I told her I could stop somewhere along the way. Some habits never disappear. Jason helped load my bags into the car. Then something unexpected happened. Several neighbors began arriving. Then more. By the time I stepped onto the driveway, nearly 20 people had gathered. Former teachers, friends, business owners, families whose children had received scholarships. Mrs. Miller stood near the front, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Someone started clapping. Others joined. Soon the entire group was applauding. I looked around in disbelief. Not because of the recognition, because I suddenly understood something I had never fully seen before. The people of Cedar Creek had noticed me all along. While I spent years believing nobody saw my effort, many people had been quietly cheering for me from a distance. Mrs. Miller stepped forward and smiled. We are proud of you, Noah. Around her, heads nodded in agreement. I glanced toward my family. My mother's eyes were shining. Jason looked proud. Even Mark smiled. A genuine smile. As I drove away later that morning, I thought about the boy who once sat alone in a dark bedroom wondering if he mattered. He had spent years trying to prove he was not a burden. In the end, he discovered something far more important. His value had never depended on the opinions of those who failed to see it. Real worth does not come from approval. It comes from character, perseverance, and the willingness to keep moving forward when nobody is clapping. The greatest surprise of all was not that I built a successful life. It was that one day, the same family that once struggled to understand me finally learned to see me clearly. And when they did, they no longer saw a burden. They saw someone who had become a source of pride, not because he proved them wrong, but because he never stopped believing there was something worth proving right.